Talk about today is education through a couple different perspectives. Like I said, I'll start by talking about the boarding schools, and then I want to talk about a more modern case of Indian education, which is the emergence in the last few decades, really starting in the 40s or 50s, but especially getting going in the last couple decades, of tribal colleges. These are universities that are sort of indigenous run and indigenous centric universities for Native people, oftentimes on reservations. And we'll sort of explore where those came from and why they're kind of an interesting experiment, and maybe think a little bit about whether they're a good idea or not. So that's our two goals today. To first start to explore the legacies of the boarding school movement. You'll see that the themes of that are running parallel to the themes we've talked about before. You'll see that some of the outcomes of the boarding schools, there are really tragic and negative outcomes of the boarding schools, and there are also some interesting, maybe you can think of them as silver linings that come out of the boarding schools, connections made, new appreciations of identity, kind of some resistance culture that have their origins in the boarding school, but they also are places of a lot of tragedy and trauma. So I don't want to oversell that point, but we'll talk about some of those outcomes, the negative and the potentially more positive outcomes of the boarding schools, and then we'll compare that and think about that alongside this the emergence of Indian colleges. So we'll start by, and again, I'm going to be kind of brief about this, about the boarding schools, even though it's a topic that can really be talked about quite a lot. And I'm going to let the film speak for me a bit, because as I said, it's full of these firsthand accounts of people who actually experience this trauma, who can talk about it obviously much more powerfully than I can. And so I'm going to let those people speak for themselves. But I'll give you, I can give you the kind of top-down perspective on this, what the boarding schools were, why they were founded, who founded them, how does it connect into our history that we've been kind of fleshing out the whole semester, really putting it into that broader perspective for you. And so the boarding schools have their origins, I went 2 slides. The boarding schools have their origins in the latter 19th century. The first ones are founded around the end of the last sort of great Indian wars, not too far removed from Wounded Knee, the massacre of Wounded Knee, and some of those other instances of the 1870s, 80s, and 90s. That's really when this is getting started. The boarding schools themselves were founded by a number of different groups. There were dozens of boarding schools across the country. Some of them were explicitly government-run. Some of them were private. Some of them were religious, Catholic or evangelical Christian, most often. And some of them were a combination of those things. They were government-backed, but they also had religious backers, for instance. And they had this goal in mind of training young Native American kids to be more fit for American society. That's the kind of underlying undercurrent of this. So the primary goal was assimilation and acculturation, to try and take Native American kids and remove from them their Native identities and replace them with something that was more useful to the American economy and an American way of life, as it was seen by the people who ran these schools. So it's really a continuation of deep acculturation models that we'd seen up until this point. The notion that Native Americans were essentially disappearing, that they would eventually be sort of evaporate into the broader American consensus of identity, and the boarding schools were supposed to encourage that, speed that up. And in fact, they really are a kind of response to the fact that hadn't happened already. This was a goal of the country for a couple of hundred years at this point already, and it hadn't happened yet. So the boarding schools are a kind of last-ditch effort, and I'm gonna make an argument to you that they were in fact one of the most powerful, quote-unquote, successful and devious acts of colonialism carried out against Native people, for some reasons that have some roots in our knowledge of how culture works, and from some ideas that cultural anthropology can teach us. So I'm going to focus on the most famous. I'm going to use as a kind of case study the most famous of the Indian boarding schools, which is called Carlisle. It's located in Pennsylvania. It was founded in 1879. It's one of the earliest of the boarding schools and was one of the longest lasting of the boarding schools. The film we're going to watch is not focused on Carlisle, so it's going to be mostly focused actually on some boarding schools that were located in New York State. But this, I'm going to talk about Carlisle a little bit because it has quite a famous history and had some of the most famous Native Americans. Celebrities of the 20th century actually went through Carlisle. Perhaps most famous is Jim Thorpe, one of the most famous athletes of all time, frankly, bar none. Certainly one of the most famous Native athletes. Quite a famous track and star athlete. Football. He was most famous for playing football at Carlisle. So the Carlisle Indian School was founded as a part of the Dawes Act. It's not like written into the law, but it essentially came to be right at the same time that the Dawes Act, which was the Allotment Act that we talked about previously, was happening. So if you recall, the Allotment Act, the Dawes Act, essentially broke up the reservations into private plots, gave away huge percentages of the land to non-native people, and it was expressly the Allotment Act had the express goal of trying to break up Native identities and Native collective natures on reservations. And so the Carlisle School and some of the other earliest boarding schools were seen as a part of that overarching project, that this was a way of retraining. The reason, one of the sort of ostensible economic reason for breaking up the reservations was, well, these aren't really economically successful areas. People aren't using the land efficiently. So when we break them up into these farming plots, then people can be more efficient. They can use the land better. They can improve the land in a better way. And so the boarding schools are seen, we're going to see in a minute, especially Carlisle is very much in this frame. They're kind of like training schools. They're like industrial training schools. And so the idea is to give Native kids like skills that they could use in the economy. That's the economic purpose of them, as opposed to the more cultural purposes that were so powerful. So Carlisle was federally funded. It was a government school in a sense. It was very much a part of this kind of salvage notion about Indian people at the time. And as I mentioned already, it was expressly a trade school. It was supposed to teach Native kids skills that they would use in the non-reservation economy. I'll leave that up for just a moment. As always, I'll put this up on Blackboard so you guys can go back and take a look at it. So Carlisle was one of the largest and most attended boarding schools in the country. It had over 10,000 students over the course of its nearly century-long history, which is a lot. I remember when we were talking about the demographics of this era, this was a period in which there were probably only tens of thousands of Native people living in the United States. It's at the kind of nadir, the lowest point of demographic population for Native people in the history of the United States. So 10,000 students is a lot. This is a pretty significant proportion of kids going through Carlisle. This is just one school. There were dozens of these schools around the country. And here's really one of the things that's really striking. Not only was it this very large number of kids that went through the school, but they came from 140 different tribal groups. So all over the country, tribal groups from across the country. We'll see. Next week, we're going to talk about the Two Spirits movement. And in something we'll watch about Two Spirits, a couple of people in that film talk about the boarding schools. They talk about them really eloquently, and they say some really interesting. They make some really interesting points about how coming in contact with kids from all these different schools from different tribes affected them. Really interesting ways.
Was it a boys' school?
No, Carlisle was co-ed.
Were these boarding schools primarily co-ed?
Some of them were, and some of them weren't, depending on the school. But Carlisle was co-ed.
But they had like equal number of boys and girls.
That I don't know. Probably. I don't know. That's a good question.
More boys. That's what I was wondering.
Yeah, I don't know whether they were, what the numbers were. It might have changed depending on the era. I'm not sure. I'd have to look that up. But Carlisle was co-ed. It did have boys and girls. So you'll notice as we go through, there's these images. These images are really iconic, and they get used in everything. You see these images everywhere. And a lot of them are from Carlisle, but sometimes they're from other boarding schools too. but the kids in the towards the goal, the stated goal of these schools, which was to quote kill the Indian and save the child, which is or save the man, is sometimes used for older people. But this phrase really comes to represent the mission of a lot of the boarding schools. That the goal was to save these kids by scrubbing them clean their native identities. That was, for some reason, this seen as a really negative part of who they were, and it needed to be taken away. And so we see these images, and I've got a bunch of them here that are so iconic. There's another one here. When the kids would come to school, they would go through sort of a highly symbolic transformation, and they often took photographs of the kids before and after they were put into their uniforms. And that uniform was more than just clothing. They had their hair cut. If they had earrings, those were taken away. Their clothing was changed. They went through a physical transformation as a part of their induction into these schools to make them look less Indian, to make them look less native, right? And so we can see these in these pictures. And then there's also non-physical aspects of this as well. They were not allowed to, say, practice their religions or really very powerfully speak their languages. And we'll see in the film how damaging that was seen to some kids, that they were no longer allowed to speak their languages. And they were forced to learn English if they didn't already know it and only speak English. So let me talk a little bit about, so that's kind of the, as I said, I'm keeping it kind of the basics here. I'm going to let the film speak about this more powerfully because we'll hear those firsthand stories. But I do want to speak about some of the outcomes, some of the mostly negative, but also some of the interesting unintended consequences of the boarding school movement. We'll see how these run quite in line with some of the things we've already talked about in the class. So one of the reasons that the boarding schools are seen as so incredibly damaging is because of a basic principle in cultural anthropology, in that culture can only exist when it is learned intergenerationally. Right? So if you guys have taken a cultural anthropology class, you'll know that the teaching of culture, what's called enculturation, from one generation to the next, is vitally important to the continued existence of that culture. And so what the boarding schools were intended to do, and in many cases did incredibly effectively, was to create a gap in that intergenerational exchange of knowledge. It took children away from their parents, usually against their will, at very young ages, 4, 5, 6 years old in many cases. And it isolated them from their communities and taught them a different way of doing it. So this was the express goal here, was to put that gap in place, to say we're not going to let that cultural knowledge transfer from one generation to the next. That was incredibly. This is, by the way, like the definition of genocide, right? I mean, that's what it's not. We're going to see some of the stories in the film. There is a physical genocide here happening as well, but this is a cultural genocide, a really powerful one, and it's a part of an ongoing one. But a lot of people see this as a moment of really powerfully effective genocidal action. Sure.
What was the word? Cultural.
Just cultural genocide.
No,
so
you said
enculturation. Yeah, enculturation is that learning how you learn culture by being kind of exposed to it, usually at a young age.
Okay, thanks.
No problem. And so what we're going to see after the boarding schools are for this period of time from the 1870s or 80s up into the middle of the 20th century is a period where traditional Native ways of being were practiced at a much lower rate than they were previously, or that they would be afterwards. We're going to see this, as we've already talked about in the last couple of weeks, that we're going to see some of these practices reemerge in the 1960s and 1970s with the civil rights movement. But there's the reason why that's seen as a revival of cultural practice is in many cases because of the boarding schools. Because the boarding schools had taken generations of kids and told them they weren't allowed to practice those traditional ways of being anymore. And so this is the reason that we needed a reemergence in the 1960s or 70s, is because of the boarding schools and other things happening at that time. But the boarding schools were a really powerful part of that. And so we have that gap. And I mentioned before how there's this period in federal recognition claims, the most difficult era that a lot of tribes have of placing right? So remember, to get your federal recognition, you have to prove, unbroken political autonomy going back to before the arrival of Europeans. And tribes often have the most trouble not with the 1650s or the 1780s or the 1860s. They have trouble with the 1930s, the 1940s, the 1950s. That's the era that a lot of tribes have trouble isolating. And a lot of that is because of boarding schools. That was a period of time in which the reservations were emptied out on purpose. That people weren't choosing to leave the reservation; they were being removed from the reservations. And a lot of times, the people who were leaving were kids, and they were going to the boarding schools, and they didn't go back to the reservations. Or when they went back to the reservations, they were different people than they were when they left. And so, it's not surprising to me that era in the first half of the 20th century is a challenging time for tribes to be able to prove their that political autonomy. But there's that same kind of unintended consequence that comes from the boarding schools that we saw last week when we talked about urbanization and the removal of tribal members off reservations and into urban communities. The goal again was to try and separate tribal people from their traditional homelands, to try and break them of that cultural tradition. But culture is a lot more sticky than that. It is hard to eradicate, frankly. So the boarding schools had that goal as well, but they had this unintended consequences of being a place where people made these connections. So that kind of national Native identity, that pan-Indian identity that emerges in the 20th century and is so important to the civil rights movement in the 1960s and 70s, a lot of that comes from the boarding schools too. Remember Carlisle, 140 tribal, 10,000 kids from 140 tribal groups around the country. These are kids that never would have met each other otherwise, made these connections. They now have this incredibly powerful shared experience, shared trauma in a lot of ways, and that those became the basis of connection for people like Dennis Banks, who we're going to see in the film in a few minutes, and who we have seen a bit of already, and others who went through the boarding schools, met people from around the country, and those became the connections that became the American Indian movement, that became the early civil rights movement in many ways, right? So that's a kind of unintended consequence of this. So again, like I said, I'm not gonna talk about that too deeply because I'm going to let some of the voices in the film speak for it. But I do want to take a few minutes, really quite briefly, to talk about this other aspect of what we might think of as Indian education or American Indian education, which is the emergence of tribal colleges. So something quite different, really a very different envisioning of what we mean by Indian education, right? So if the boarding schools were education that was aimed at specifically at Indian kids, American Indian kids, tribal colleges have that same mission, right? These are places that are designed to educate American Indian kids, but they really couldn't be more different, couldn't be more world apart. And so I want to talk a little bit about the history of where tribal colleges come from, again, how they fit into this broader 20th century history, and can tell us a little bit about the history of American Indian people in the 20th century and coming into today. So really, the tribal colleges have their roots in the 1930s and 1940s. So after as the boarding schools were winding down, as the destructive nature of the termination policies, and of the Allotment Act, the Dawes Act, people kind of came to terms with that. Some more progressive, you notice the time period, 33 to 45, right? This is FDR's administration. Some more progressive leadership in the BIA, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and the Department of the Interior, which is the broader part of the government under which the BIA exists. Some more progressive leaders in there presented some different ideas that actually had some benefits for Native people, are seen as being long-term really beneficial for Native people. So one of those folks was named John Collier, and he was in charge of the BIA in the 1930s and 1940s during FDR's administration. And he was a reformer, so he put in place a lot of the policies that are going to become the root of what we see of today as the kind of self-administration. Again, I'm asking you to go back to way back to the end of the semester when we talked about sovereignty issues. I talked about self-determination, right, which is the goal that tribes tend to have towards sovereignty. What they actually have is self-administration, which is not perfect, but is better than what it was previously. Self-administration is when you have a constitution and a group of tribal elders who run the policies of the tribe, even though you still don't really have that full level of sovereignty. Well, that notion, that level of freedom, really comes from the Collier administration in the 1930s and 1940s. So he believed in a kind of self-sufficiency goal for tribal governments and wanted to empower tribal governments to kind of take care of themselves, if you will. A law was passed in 1934, not long after Collier came into power, called the Indian Reorganization Act, which basically ends the allotment era. And it encourages tribes to adopt their own constitutions to run their own business. So it's also called the Wheeler-Howard Act.
Can you go back to that last one?
Sure, yeah. Do that here too. No problem. All right. Again, yeah, don't feel like you need to write every word down. I'll give you. I know I'm moving through these kind of ways, but so essentially, what the law does is it gives tribes the opportunity, federally recognized tribes, the opportunity to adopt their own constitutions, to elect their own leaderships, and in some cases, we're going to see a transfer of power in some of the biggest boarding schools into tribal hands. So some of the boarding schools are actually going to be run by Native people after this, right? I think that becomes kind of the root of an idea for tribal colleges, which will come a little bit later. Oh, excuse me. Another important factor in this is somewhat unrelated, is the GI Bill. So the GI Bill, if you're not aware, is was a law that was passed during World War II. I think it was passed in World War II. That was meant to encourage people to sign up for the military, men primarily at first. And it said that if you fought for the military, if you went to Europe or to Japan or in some later wars, that the U.S. government would pay for you to go to college when you got back home. This is a very famous piece of legislation. It's seen as a really important step for expanding the importance of public universities like our own, and also for really expanding, sort of democratizing college. Because prior to the GI Bill, really the kind of the notion of what university is and who it's for changes a lot because of the GI Bill. I've mentioned before that Native men, and nowadays Native women too, serve in the military at the highest rate of any ethnic or racial group in the United States. They really serve in the military at very, very high rates per capita. And so the GI Bill, for that reason, affected Native people in a huge way. This gave an opportunity to go to college for a lot of Native men after World War II that wouldn't previously have happened. And so we see after World War II a lot of Native men going to college, being the first in their families to do so. Sure. No, I think there's a long tradition of serving in the military in Native communities that goes all the way back to like pre-revolution, and it's just frankly, impoverished communities are more likely to serve in the military in general, and so Native people tend to be have higher rates of poverty. So there's some correlation there, and there's also just a long tradition of it. So it's just a thing a lot of Native folks do, serve in the military at really high rates, depending on which tribe you're in. So. But the benefits, some people certainly join the military for the benefits because,
I imagine their job opportunities are quite.
Exactly, I think that's the reason why you see among low-income communities higher rates in military service, because it is a career option, and because of things like the GI Bill, it can be an opportunity for upward mobility in that way. So I think that's one of the reasons that we certainly do see that in Native communities. But there's also this very deep, hundreds of years long tradition of Native people serving in the military for the United States and even for colonial governments before that. It goes all the way back to the 17th century. So it's an interesting question, though, yeah. But I don't think the GI Bill is certainly not a disincentive, that's for sure. So what we see with the GI Bill and more and more Native people, men at first and later women too, going to college more is that encourages a kind of tradition of going to university, and people see the benefits of higher education, both economically and socially for communities. And so somewhere along the line, some folks get the idea that perhaps Native people can kind of create their own college system, their own sort of internal university system that would give Native folks both a practical education, the education they need to become professionals in any kind of, all kinds of different fields, the same reason anybody goes to college, but also that these would be colleges that would, because I think people were felt dissatisfied with the education they were getting in the broader public university system. We see this in the University of California system, where a lot of Native kids went to school in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, and they do things like start cultural centers and start the first Native American Studies programs because they're not getting the history they're being taught is still hundreds of years old. History that doesn't teach their history, right? The anthropology classes they're taking, they feel like don't do a very good job of teaching about their own history, right? So they're kind of craving an indigenous education, an education that will put their own histories at the center. And so I think a lot of people see Indian colleges as a place where that can happen. I think that's one of the things that Indian colleges are hope to achieve. They also have this really kind of more practical consideration where, yes, you're going to go to college, get that indigenous perspective, but going to a university also gives you the opportunity for economic success outside of rights. That's what I mean there by mitigating their relationship with the state. What I mean by that is that it also gives people the opportunity to make their way in the broader economy and in broader politics and in the broader professional settings that's going to allow the tribe to sort of succeed. So they're seen as a positive place there. I'll give you a moment with that before I move on. And then, of course, the last thing is fairly straightforward. These are really accessible places of higher education for tribal members, and for tribes that can afford it, they can give tribal members subsidies to go. And so it's an opportunity for the tribes to create a professional class internally, right? Doctors, lawyers, politicians, even anthropologists and archaeologists and historians and all the kind of folks that you need to make, if you want to make a federal recognition claim or if you want to do a land claim, right, you need those kind of professionals as well. And so we see that these tribal colleges are a place where a kind of American Indian professional class can be supported and emerge in that way. Sure.
So I understand that obviously Native made colleges give